Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I am sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas from my guest expert, Stefanie Johnson. Together, we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. And Next Pivot Point, I believe we're stronger together. We are one. Well, I am super thrilled to kick off this season with our guest today. So Dr. Stefanie Johnson is with us, and she is an associate professor at CU Boulder's Leeds School of Business. She holds the Andrea and Michael Leeds Research Fellowship, is the director of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, and is a 2020 ROI Fellow. She's a fellow in the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists and the American Psychological Society. She's published 60 journal articles and book chapters and outlets, Journal of Applied Psychology and the Academy of Management Journal, and has received $3.8 million in external grant funding. Dr. Johnson is a member of the MG 100 Coaches and was selected for the 2020 Thinkers 50 Radar list, and is the author of the national bestseller, which we're going to talk about today, Inclusify, Harnessing the Power of Uniqueness and Belonging to Build Innovative Teams. It was published by HarperCollins. She has presented her work at Diversity over 170 meetings around the world, including the White House for a 2016 summit on diversity in corporate America. And media outlets have featured Stefanie's work. They include The Economist, Newsweek, Time, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Huffington Post, and many, many more. So I'm so thrilled to have you, Dr. Johnson. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for that very detailed, kind introduction.
Well, it's such a body of work you have. And I got my hands on this book as soon as it came out this summer, which, knowing all of the wildness that we've experienced in 2020, you had to be thinking either I was really onto something or, wow, this book is already outdated because so much has changed. So tell our listeners, why now? What do you see kind of midway through 2020? Why does diversity and inclusion still matter? And I would argue matters now more than ever.
Yeah, it's definitely more than ever. And I think people have a new awareness of diversity and inclusion, right? Like it's kind of top of mind for a lot of organizations. I've never seen so many companies releasing diversity, pro-diversity, Black Lives Matter statements. Like even in the wake of Me Too, I think some organizations spoke up, but not like this. I think this is the time, this is the point in history where I think people are recognizing that we need to change things. And so why now? Well, because it should have been then, we should have done this many years ago, but it's a super relevant topic, but also I'm going to argue that this is the easiest time to make change because all of our organizations have basically changed anyway. And so as we put them back together, why not do it in a way that is more inclusive, more diverse, more effective than it was before? So there's actually benefits that come out of this like massive crisis in history.
Well, yeah, change. We're already changing. Why not change this too?
Exactly.
Well, and I think too, what we're seeing is people really want to bring their full human self to work. And I love the way you have the book outlined with kind of those two key factors, because traditionally the words diversity and inclusion have gone together. Some have brought in the words equity or belonging, kind of strung them in or added them to as a wrapper. But I really like in your work how you have the 2x2 matrix. So for our listeners, if you haven't snagged a copy of this book yet, we will link in the show notes to it. Inclusify is what you want to get. And the two factors from your research, belonging and uniqueness. So why do both matter? And why do organizations, usually they focus on one or the other and not both at the same time?
So true.
Tell us more about that.
these are the most basic and essential human needs. It's to belong. Like, I think that has been recognized. I think it was 2019's diversity and inclusion trend of the year was belonging. So a lot of organizations changed their program to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Um, in fact, I did a LinkedIn learning course called Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. It's just like it's the feeling that you are accepted and valued and part of the group, that like human instinct to be a part of. However, and organizations, many of them do this really well, but however, we don't just want to belong. We want to belong while being our true unique self. So if I have to change everything about me in order to belong, then I still don't feel included, because I don't really belong. This other person that I created is accepted, but that might not really be me.
Yeah, and the term covering comes to mind with that. Having to cover or filter a part of yourself to belong is exhausting. People of color, women experience this a lot in a white male dominated workplace. Another piece that I loved from your book is you have these archetypes. So you have these characters. And I know in the work I do in corporate America, you see it too. uh, there's these really well-intentioned people that want to get involved in diversity inclusion, and they don't know they're not doing it right. They're, and it's really, really good-hearted, and you want to honor it, but you also want to say, and you could do more of this, or maybe
Yes.
less of this. And this is a really helpful way to frame feedback in a way that's not going to hurt somebody's feelings, not going to damage egos, but also to help them understand, no, this is what we mean by being inclusive as a leader, what I would call an ally. This is more of what you could do based on those two factors. So tell us about the archetypes you found in your research, and watch outs for those that want to be more inclusive.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that is so great about the uniqueness and belonging and the archetypes is that if you've ever given feedback and they like, tell me what I'm doing well, tell me what I should do more of, tell me what I should do less of, and what should I keep doing. I think that if we give people feedback on diversity and inclusion and we say, well, you're not doing enough uniqueness, we don't want them to flip all the way. Like, people are often, who think they're doing a good job, are often doing some things really well. And so this is more of, I think it fits perfectly well with your show, because I use the word pivot in saying, like, this is, you're doing this really well, and you can sprinkle in a little bit of this to be even more effective than you already are. And so it falls along those two axes of uniqueness and belonging, that the idea that some leaders really do a great job fostering belonging, and everyone is super cohesive, and you only hire people who are a culture fit, and you reinforce culture fit over and over again. I call them culture crusaders. They're like the Silicon Valley, sometimes finance, Wall Street types that they're actually pretty cohesive, but only if you fit the culture. That's the whole point of culture fit. And what that does is it lacks the uniqueness part. So for one thing, people who don't fit the culture won't be brought in. And so you're missing out on that diversity of thought and perspective. But then in reality, there's no doubt there's people in the organization who don't fit in, who are like faking or covering or masking parts of themselves. And as you said, that's super exhausting. It makes people want to quit their jobs, and it misses out on all of the information that could be brought to bear if they actually contributed that difference of thought. So that's Culture Crusader. And there's I don't know if you have any thoughts or reactions. I know you read the
Oh
book.
yeah, no, it struck me because I think that's the old age-old excuse with diversity and inclusion that you addressed it right from the get-go in the book, that you can't use that excuse, well, they're not a cultural fit. And I always, when I get that feedback, when people say, yeah, we tried to recruit diverse talent, they just don't fit our culture. They just don't stay.
Yeah,
It's like, that's an excuse. That there's a reason why, and that's that uniqueness factor rearing. I mean, that's really relevant. That's why you need both uniqueness and belonging. And so we want to honor the unique differences that someone brings to our culture. And I've heard different language around cultural add, other ways that you can use inclusive language rather than cultural fit.
absolutely. Yeah. So this culture crusader. On the flip side, some of the allies, and every woman who I've spoken to nods their head and has experienced this. There are the leaders who are really well-intentioned, good-hearted, trying to celebrate uniqueness. And usually that comes in the form of being a champion for, most often it's women, but it could be people of color. And as a result, they actually end up undermining the people that they are trying so hard to support. And so that's not good. Those are the white knights. Have you ever
Oh, the,
experienced?
the knight in shining armor. And,
Yes.
and for women, you're exactly right. I mean, how many fairy tales did I read as a kid in the 80s and 90s? I mean, it's amazing I'm an independent woman having watched movies like The Little Mermaid growing up. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
it is reinforced in our culture. And thankfully that rhetoric is now disproven. And your research really highlights, though, that's still very, very is very relevant still in corporate America, because men, especially senior white men, I know I had this happen to me a lot in corporate America, well-intentioned, like, let me help you. Let me basically save the day for you. That's not sustainable. It teaches people to rely on people. It's not a healthy dynamic in the workplace. It really, but again, well-intentioned, like you
Super
said.
wrong. Yeah. And the other thing that it does is creates a lot of backlash. So there'll be men on, let's just say you're a man, white knight, and you're really trying to support your maybe one female employee. And so you bring this up a lot and try to champion this person. The other people in the group feel like very quickly that they're not treated fairly. And in the end, most of the data show those other people still get all the promotions and earn more money, and they feel like they're treated unfairly. So like surveys of discrimination and bias at work show men report as much, if not more, bias against them than women do, and whites than people of color. Persons with disabilities probably report the most, but we shouldn't be creating organizations where now everyone feels like they're discriminated against. In fact, we should be working to create organizations where no one feels they're discriminated against, right? So that is the white knight. And then probably my favorite, I guess, the one I saw a lot of, not the most of, but is the Meritocracy Manager. And that's a leader who doesn't focus on uniqueness or belonging, but instead kind of sets up a competitive environment. I use the analogy, or someone gave me a quote. It's like the Hunger Games of like, good luck. And so no one really feels like a cohesive team because they're all competing against each other. And the leader, our manager, just reinforces this idea of like, whoever's the best person for the job, whoever performs the best, sells the most, will get promoted. And then people don't have their uniqueness seen, and no one feels like they belong, which just means if you're going to make this a purely financial relationship, then I will quickly find another organization that either pays me more because that's all our relationship is, or that does value at least one of these two human needs, right? Helps me feel like I belong, or values the unique perspective that I bring.
Yeah, those lay out so nicely. And I think for our listeners, you probably know everybody, you know a few people from those archetypes, and you can identify with that. And then you can use the framework to really provide that additive feedback rather than call somebody out, call somebody into the conversation as, here's how you can be more inclusive.
Yeah.
I know, Stephanie, that's one of the biggest questions I get, as I know you speak on this topic a lot, is, what do I do when so-and-so says this? And it's this like definitely microaggression, maybe even macroaggression type of language.
Yeah.
And I think calling people in is, hey, when you said that, my feedback's always kind of like, when you said that or when you did that, I get you had good intentions honoring that. Here's how it could be more helpful next time, or here's how you could, promote more uniqueness, promote more belonging. And so maybe those filters help people give feedback when you have a conversation or a talking point that goes off the radar a little bit.
Yeah,
Other
absolutely.
thoughts on that? Like when someone says or does something that demonstrates one of those archetypes, those behaviors that are unhelpful, how do you recommend someone address that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it kind of depends on the day of the week, because I'll say for me, definitely, you know, this is my area of expertise, and there's still moments where so I don't know if you know this, but I'm half Mexican. So, and that's like a huge part of my identity and my culture. And I'll hear someone make anti-Hispanic comments because they don't know that I'm Mexican, because I think it's like the blonde hair and stuff. But
Yeah, well, and you address that in your book, that people can pass, right? And
yeah,
be in both, but not feel like they belong in
right.
either group. And that's a
Well,
big
how
part
would
of
you?
you, but your identity, you don't necessarily look that identity. So people don't know that that's a part of your identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they say these really awful things that are super racist, and they think it's okay to share this. And, in most instances, I like what you said of calling them in and saying, why did you say that? Or can you tell me what you were intending there? Or did you know that I'm Mexican? And then there's other days that I'm just like, I just can't. I'm just so tired. And today, this is not the battle that I want to have. Like, I need to save my emotional energy for something else. And same thing with when I hear sexist comments. If someone um, calls me a girl, which is like kind of diminishes women's authority. There's sometimes where I want to address it, and I've tried to do this. Maybe I make a joke about it, which I don't actually think is that effective. But and then there's other days where I'm just like, it's not happening today. And so I think that's a big reason why, if we all work together, it can actually be so much more effective, because I may be having one of those, like, I just can't, I just can't do it days. And maybe you're not. And if someone says that, you can actually step in, or a white guy can step in, or
Yeah.
anyone, and say, like, they can be the one to say, like, do you know how that sounded? Or even ask the person later, take them aside and say, you made this comment earlier, and I just want to bring it to your attention that
Yeah.
it,
Well, it's a great opportunity for an ally to stand with somebody, because you're right. It's exhausting going through those experiences and hearing those things on an ongoing basis. And I think right now we're seeing that with Black Lives Matter now, with people of color in the workplace. They're tired of educating white people about this. They're tired of having to explain why Black Lives Matter.
oh yeah.
And we need white people to really stand up and talk about this and do their own education about this. So knowing that your book came out, I mean, wow, what, 10 days after George Floyd?
Mhm.
I mean, it was very, very, I remember I had it on pre-order already because I'd seen one of my allies had posted about it, and I was anxious to read it. And then the world just took fire with Black Lives Matter. What has been your experience with people responding to your book, knowing that you wrote it, not knowing the pandemic was going to happen, that this was going to happen this summer? What has your experience been like as people have been reading the book?
I think pretty positive. It feels needed, and it's really practical. It's kind of like, depending on your archetype, you can actually take a quiz at inclusify.com, and it'll tell you what your greatest tendency is, and then give you advice. And if you go through the book, there'll be much more advice of, add this, like, sprinkle in some of this uniqueness. Here's some tools. Do this in your meeting. Do this um, in trying to be more empathetic. And so I think people find that really useful, because it is really hard to go from 0 to 60. And there's just like a lot of people who hadn't thought about this. And, on some days I'm like, really? This, like, you never knew this was going on? Come on. And other days I'm like, I feel empathy. Like, imagine that you just had this huge wake up call, and you're like, whoa, I have been, say, contributing to systemic racism, which I'm sure, we all are in various ways, right? And you have to face this. knowing that we really want to be good people. And that was the thing with the book. It's like most people really wanted to do this well. No one was like, I don't really want to be inclusive. I want to like leave people out as much as possible. So with that like good intention, I feel like it can be really threatening to people to have to face, okay, first I need to admit it's not that I'm not a good person, but I can do more. I can contribute more to my organization and be a more effective leader, do a better job. And while trying to feel like, oh no, and I don't want to be a bad person. So I think people like it for that reason of it's not like, it's just like, just add these things in. Like you don't have to become an entirely new person overnight. Every journey starts with a step, right? So you can start.
Well, and back to what you said at the beginning about change.
Mm-hmm.
Change brings more change. And so we're at a time when you've changed a lot already in your life. So why not switch it up a little bit more in how you're looking at inclusion and diversity and how you can be a voice when maybe you haven't been speaking up as much as you could.
Absolutely.
And I think too, for our listeners, you do such a great job of giving language and vocabulary to these things. I'm probably going to goof on the term you call this, but we get really defensive, I think, about diversity and inclusion, like self-protection kind of comes in, which you're alluding to of like, oh, it didn't feel good that I haven't. I've said things like, I'm not a racist, but, these comments that well-intentioned white people have said. Or, no one wants to be sexist either. And we've applied these labels and they've created some defensiveness from our potential allies. So instead of thinking of all those defensive reasons and self-protection things, focus instead on, hey, I can do more. We can all do more. And how could I use my voice? How could I amplify others? And the book has a series of recommendations on little subtle actions. But I think for our listeners, it's an intentional series of choices that you make. And you make a difference. Even if you're not a leader, quote unquote, in corporate America, you have a voice, right? And you don't have to speak up on social media if that's not your thing. You can volunteer, you can read. I think talking to our children about what's going on that's something everybody can do. And if you don't have children, talk to other children about it. The next generation. One thing that's been fascinating for me this summer, Stefanie, has been just realizing, again, I grew up in the 80s and 90s in the suburbs in the Midwest. So you can imagine what that was like. It was actually pretty decent diversity numbers in my high school, probably representative of of the population at the time. But the late 90s in particular, I think we've learned that the rhetoric was, we don't see color. Racism has gone away, right? We're over it. So don't talk about it because that's conflict and that's unnecessary and unproductive. So I legitimately, when I entered corporate America in the early 2000s, I thought sexism was gone. Everything was equal, that I don't see color and that doesn't matter anyway. And then imagine, and I think this is what people are still waking up to now, that it all is still happening. It's very real. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person. To your point, if you haven't seen it before, now that you see it, you can't unsee it, which is the beauty of your research, is because how can you look at these stats and not understand that it is happening? And if I know that it's happening, I have to do something about it, even if it is somewhat a small but intentional step.
Yeah.
So share with me, I'm curious, what have been the pushbacks on your research? So when people are like, I know I get this one, I don't know if I believe that statistic, or where did you get that information? Because you have so much information in here. I mean, I want to read off all these stats. They're just so good. Where do people struggle? Where are people still surprised even now?
So I don't know now. So I'll say, like, when I give talks and stuff, they're all over Zoom since the book came out. So I don't know that I get it as much as when I was face to face or working with companies or doing a presentation to a board. But I think before this world, I think people did that a lot. Just like, I don't believe your data. You have a stake in this, and you're clearly advocating for a position. You're not approaching this as a a researcher, which is actually what I am. I'm a professor. So I do research to find answers.
PhD, by the way.
not to push an agenda, right? But when I was talking to a board, this is some years ago now, and someone literally raised their hand and said, I don't believe your data. I think earlier you made a mistake at something you said. I'm not going to tell you what it was, but and that makes me question everything you said. And I was like, it's not really my data. I mean, I think it's like Morgan Stanley, and like, I didn't create these numbers. I wish I had that power to collect this like awesome data about what companies are doing and the impact of diversity, the positive benefits. But I think it's the denial phase of like, if you haven't experienced it, maybe you just think like no one experienced it because it's not what you were taught and you don't see it. But I think now, I mean, maybe, so I would love to say everyone's aware, but I still see these comments of people who are like deniers. I mean, there's like the Flat Earther Society, people who believe the earth is flat. So if we can't even convince people the earth is round, how are we going to convince them that diversity pays, or that there is still discrimination, or like some people, you're just never going to change their mind. But those aren't the people who read my book, I would say, or attend my talks, unless they're just there to, people write like mean comments. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sure, I don't know, do you ever get those like
the trolls?
Trolls, yes.
And I'm kind of excited at first that they've read it, because they're the ones that really need to read it. But then at the same time, their defensiveness, and a lot of times around race, their white fragility around it is, it's hard to respond to, because I get defensive and then I just want to attack back, which, that's not going to go anywhere. So I take a deep breath, and I usually like walk around for a little bit and like burn off the emotional energy before.
Yeah.
It sounds like this really struck you. I'm so curious why this is so important to you.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, I've heard that recently, like when you're in these conversations, of course we all have opinions, but consider like entering conversations with the mindset of like learning. We don't need to tell everyone your opinion all the time. I think we all really need to be listening, because we don't understand every lived experience. And I think we're a lot better, smarter people if we could understand more. And so rather than entering with this, like, I'm going to try to convince you where the hole is in your data. And I'll give you an example here. This is a while ago, one of my colleagues said, hasn't the gender pay gap been disproven? I'm like, we never really prove anything, but no, I don't know what you mean. They're like, well, isn't it when you control for women's choice? This is obviously man. Isn't it when you control for women's choices that there is no gender pay gap? It's just women choose lower paying jobs. No, but they were very convinced with their position. And so I just like really tried to listen, like where are you getting this information? Could you consider what would an alternative interpretation of the data be? And like if women are making 25% less than men, would choice account for a quarter of the pay difference? And it's interesting, because if you let people really think about their argument, sometimes they kind of come around on their own, which is the best
Exactly.
outcome.
They want to get there on their own. They don't want to be disproven by somebody else, no one wants to be wrong.
For sure.
They're going to be defensive as long as they think they're going to be found out or be wrong. And people are going to believe whatever data they want to believe. I mean, at the end of the day, we make decisions based on emotions, not by facts and figures. But it's always nice to have our facts and figures in the diversity world ready to go, just in case. But I love that point about listening to learn. I'm reminded by the listening research and the empathy research of, if I go into a conversation wanting to share what I know, I walk out of that conversation knowing what I already know.
Yeah.
If I go into the conversation curious and listening, I learned something in that conversation, so I know more than I did before.
Right.
I try to remind myself of that, but wow, our brains are wired to continuously work.
Yeah.
And so we want to listen, to respond, to share, impart our thoughts. And I find that difficult, especially with arguments that are counter to mine.
Right.
And the one I'm getting right now, I'd be curious, as we wrap up here, all the corporate statements that came out, right?
Yeah.
We talked about this as we were preparing for today. All these wonderful corporate statements in June about diversity and Black Lives Matter and what they're doing. They're deeply committed, all these great words that were used. Some even backed it up with action plans. I have to say, there's some great examples out there. But a lot, it was rhetoric. I mean, they were words. And all employee type of, rah, rah, we're going to, be focused on this type of things. Now it's kind of like, well, where's the action sustained, right? What's the real talk behind, or walk behind the talk? And you said, that very pointedly, that they were focused on the D, the diversity, not necessarily the I, the inclusion, which we know you have to have both. So tell our listeners, for if you might be at an organization, support an organization, or know an organization that despite their best efforts are not sure of their deep commitment or not demonstrating long-term commitment, what do you do to get that inclusion factor up? Like what do you recommend in today's climate?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I like the corporate actions, the statements. I mean, I feel like it's probably better that people are making statements than pretending none of this is going on. But some of the big Fortune 500 companies have actually put very specific, like, this is our goal by 2025 to have, parity in this way, or hire this many more Black directors, or increase gender representation by 20%, or whatever it is. And I think those are really good to have that number, because if you're trying to pursue that number, you will quickly realize that it's a losing battle to just try to hire people, because they'll just leave if there's no inclusion. And so you're spending a lot of company resources, especially if you're like facing down a 5-year timeline where you want to succeed, because this is, normal. If we put our name against a number, we're going to want to get there. And you're hiring a lot of diverse talent, and then you're having a lot of turnover, both of maybe conflict with your white employees who feel like, or it doesn't matter what race the employees are, people who don't buy into this cultural change might be leaving, which maybe that's good. They can find an organization that fits them. And the new people you're hiring in are leaving because they're like, they get there and they're like, well, I don't really feel like I can be myself, or I don't feel included, I don't feel valued. They're going to go, trust me, there's lots of organizations who are doing the same thing. So they can easily go somewhere else. So I think it's the inclusion factor that's really going to make the difference. And of course, they just have to read Inclusify, and then easy peasy. But I'll give one or two things, I guess. One, I really liked what you said earlier about, like, we can all be doing this. Like, we can all be amplifying Black voices, and we can all be raising, like, bystanders or maybe upstanders. If someone is making comments that are inconsistent with your corporate values, I think it's fair game to point that out. And in fact, I think it's necessary that all of us are working to do that. So all of the work isn't falling on the shoulders of the people who are like carrying this burden already, right? So yes, it is, we can all work to amplify voices. And the second thing is, I think meetings are just a huge inclusion suck. Like, we might be doing a great job, we're in our office, we're working, and then you go to the meeting and your accomplishments aren't celebrated, or you're not included in the conversation, or people don't hear what you say or talk over you. I think that's when it really hits home. Like, these are not my people. So if you can really, that's like a good first or second step of just focusing on improving those meeting dynamics so that you are hearing from everyone. And since you worked so hard to recruit and hire a more diverse workforce, like, you might as well get the benefit from it, which is that difference of thought, innovation, creativity, better decision-making, by making sure they speak and they're heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just focusing on the recruiting piece. And I think that's the temptation right now. And you raise a good point. It's going to be more competitive. It was already competitive before. It's going to be way more competitive now. So before you spend all of your efforts and time and resources on the recruiting piece to drive the D, focus on the I so that when they come, they want to stay. And you're right, the meeting. I like to say I can watch a meeting in corporate America. Now you can actually record them on Zoom to see it. And you know how inclusive that team is just
Yeah.
by who speaks, who gets interrupted, whose idea is supported by the team. I mean, there's all these microaggressions that happen in those meetings that you can tell how inclusive it is. So pay attention to meeting behavior. It's a very big deal.
Mhm.
Oh, Stephanie, this has been so fun to spend time with you. So Inclusify is the book. You all have to check it out. We'll link to that in the show notes. And then the quiz is available at inclusifier.com.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, perfect. Other ways that our listeners can follow you and stay in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a social media at Dr. Steph Johnson, DrStefJohn, that's the one, or Inclusify book. You can hashtag, and that'll connect me right away. So, and they can email me too. You can email me through my website, drstephjohnson.com. And I love, the feedback and perspectives, because that is my orientation, to go through the world trying to learn other people's views. And so I love to hear it, even if it's the trolls.
The real takes. Yes, real feedback. And it is action packed. I say, my reaction after I read the book, I went into it thinking, yeah, I'm already going to know this stuff. And that's a bad way to look at it, just like we're talking in our conversation. And I quickly thought, oh, I've got a lot to learn here, and I'm excited. So I have this packed with tabs. As I was prepping for the interview, I was like, I don't even know where to start my questions, because I can talk to you for hours, because it's so real with stats, figures, language, those archetypes, that 2x2. There's some really robust tools in here. So I think that's unlike other diversity books that simply just raise awareness. This is more of a how-to. And I think that's what people really want right now, is how do I do this? How do I drive inclusion? So this has been so great to spend time with you, Dr. Stefanie Johnson. I am so thankful for the time and for you sharing your message and for doing all the great work you're doing. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I want to come back. Okay.
Yes, we're going to come back when we have things to celebrate, because there's going to be policy changes. There's going to be more than 7% women and 4 Black CEOs in corporate America. I mean, it's just amazing how much more work we have to do. So this is conversation to be continued.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Julie.
I appreciate you listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Simply hit the share button, connect with me on LinkedIn. You can search Julie Kratz, Kratz. Help us by sharing this episode anywhere you get podcasts. Every review helps others allies find us. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I host this because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.